South Africa's economy is losing billions of rand each year as a result of extensive illicit activities such as unlawful mining, counterfeit goods trade, wildlife trafficking, pharmaceuticals, and illicit alcohol and tobacco. A recently released report from the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade on organized crime, corruption, and illicit trade shows that this trade is one of the biggest threats to stability and economic growth in the country. The TRACIT report, which was released in partnership with Business Unity South Africa, revealed that the country's market for illicit alcohol was historically large, with the South Africa Revenue Service estimated to be losing out on 11 billion rand in excise tax revenue a year due to illicit alcohol trade. This represents the largest fiscal loss from illicit alcohol out of 7 African countries. Now, in terms of lost tax revenues, Business Leadership South Africa estimates that the country loses around 250 million rand per day, which comes to 91.25 billion rand annually. These estimates align with Global Authority estimates, with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, calculating the losses at between 69 billion and 98 billion a year, or more than 1% of South Africa's GDP. Joining me now is Esteban Jaducci. He's the Director of Programs at Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, TRACIT, who is responsible for that report into South Africa's illicit trade. Esteban, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us here, and good morning to you and to your audience. It's very important to visualize this problematic, so we are grateful for this opportunity.
Fantastic. So let's look at the numbers right now, because with South Africa, the number is put at about 100 billion rand per year lost in tax revenue. And this illicit trade, unfortunately, is nothing that is particularly new. So let's start with how this trade is negatively affecting or influencing the country's growth and stability.
Yes, okay, there are many things to be said, but let me just quickly go back to the headlines that you were presenting a few seconds ago, just before this interview commenced. You mentioned Ghana and the situation, how they are grappling with the negotiation with the IMF. You also mentioned inflation in Zimbabwe. You also mentioned a similar situation in Egypt. And I mean, in these countries of Africa, we can see the same patterns that we have found in South Africa. And we have very compelling reports that we produce with TRACIT to show how illicit trade undermines all the economic prospects of the countries. For instance, a report on the link between sovereign credit ratings and illicit trade. It appears that countries that are more prone to illicit trade and are worse equipped to fight illicit trade, it's more difficult for them to get lines of credits. This is the situation that's going on with Ghana right now. I mean, when it comes to inflation, we have recently launched a report from Turkey, last week as well in Istanbul, where we showcase how inflation is generated by illicit trade. I mean, there is a negative correlation between those two phenomena. And when it comes to South Africa, I mean, I'm not going to repeat the figures that you just mentioned. It's around 6 billion loss in US dollars, billion with a B, it's of loss for the South African economy. And the patterns that we see there is that this is facilitated by corruption. This generates organized crime. It affects many different sectors. And one very important thing to take into consideration is that it's not only a problem from the point of view of organized crime and also for the financial prospects of the country, but it also has serious implications for the health of the consumers, for the environment, and other more egregious forms of criminality, as it can be trafficking human beings or money laundering. I mean, it's something that is very serious. It's not just an economic problematic.
And it's important that we note that. But I want to go back to something. I like the fact that you were listening to the headlines and you made those connections with Ghana, Egypt, and Zimbabwe. Because my next question is really, South Africa is not the only African economy that is unfortunately being hit hard by illicit trade. So how big of an issue is illicit trade across the continent? If we were sort of to weigh it on a scale, how much are we looking at when it comes to the continental illicit trade and how it's impacting African economies?
Well, your question is very good. I mean, right now we deploy this work in South Africa because it's one of the BRICS countries, because it's one of its leaders in the region. but there are some studies that's done in other African countries. I know them a little bit by sector. I know that the problematic, for instance, in Nigeria related to illicit trade and to illicit tobacco, it's quite considerable. I don't have exact figures because it's very difficult to do the estimations, and they change. The last study I saw in Nigeria was from 2019. I can also mention something similar in Egypt, but I mean, the problem that we see in South Africa, we have more granular information because we did this report to find some traction in that country, but we assume that the situation in other African countries is very similar or worse, and this depends on each specific sector. Coming back to Nigeria, we know that there is a big problem with illicit pharmaceuticals too, and it's something that needs to be looked at, and that's why we are trying to generate some political momentum in the African
Rand
region.
100 is missing something.
Sorry?
Let's also look at the why and the how it's happening, because there are conversations around, particularly with South Africa, corruption and state capture, and how that has, of course, unfortunately, hampered and crippled organizations like the Revenue Service. So in terms of South Africa, is this happening because of poor regulation? Is it a lack of enforcement? Where does the blame lie when we look at the South African situation concerning illicit trade?
Well, first, I wouldn't put it in the words of blame line, but things that need to be looked at. We need to understand when we come out from the COVID-19 pandemic, no one knew what to do, but what needs to be done? What are the problems, let's say, in South Africa? It's not a problem of not having standards or not having, let's say, the capability of doing it. It's a problem of effectiveness of the regulations that they are already in place. And what is very interesting is that the conclusions that we drafted in our report, they are very similar to the recommendations and to the action plan that South Africa is putting forward with the Financial Action Task Force. What happened with the Financial Action Task Force? It's a body that grey listed South Africa because there are problems to counter financial crimes and money laundering. And interestingly, many of the recommendations that this international body produced are very similar to the ones that we propose to fighting illicit trade. This means enhancing enforcement and also the coordination, the multilateral coordination and interagency coordination at national level. This means that all the efforts that law enforcement does need not to be squandered anymore. This should become intelligence. This should be translated into in-depth investigation of financial crimes to go after the masterminds of this type of crimes, because there is clearly transnational organized crime behind this illicit trade in many diverse sectors. This is not a problem of the retailers that are on the street selling cigarettes, alcohol, footwear, or whatnot. This is a problem of a lack of enforcement of the existing standards, and that's where we are trying to put emphasis. But the good thing is that last week, when we were in South Africa launching this report, we managed to find some traction with some key stakeholders, namely the Treasury of South Africa, also the police forces of South Africa, and we are trying to establish an agenda to find the political will and the political momentum, and also to convey capacity. This is something that TRACIT is doing in different countries, for instance in Panama, where we see similar situations, and the interesting thing is that we are trying to find real traction between the public and the private sector, because it's the only way that we are going to be able to tackle these problematics from all the angles that are required to find a suitable solution and to curb this problem. We need to do it to improve the future for our children.
So I like the fact you mentioned the agencies and you talk about political will and a lack of enforcement, because it naturally leads one to ask, because as I mentioned earlier, we're all aware of the state capture issue, the corruption issue that unfortunately bedevils South Africa, but it would naturally lead one to ask how proficient or how adequately South Africa is working to fight the illicit trade that's costing the economy and consumers so much as well. In terms of the role of agencies, there's been conversation about the complicity of state actors and even the potential for them to even be facilitating illicit crime and illicit trade. What did your report find in regards to this?
Well, yes, there is some evidence of what you just mentioned. There is evidence, of course, corruption is a facilitator for illicit trade. Probably you are familiarized with some reports from other media that were released on the relationship between illicit tobacco, the proceeds of this crime, and trafficking in gold to launder those criminal proceeds, and that's why we have the problem with the Financial Action Task Force. Yes, every system has its glitches. Even the countries that are rated with less corruption in the world, they still have problems of corruption in relation to illicit trade. I can mention here Singapore. It's something that happens. But the good thing is that there are good practices that we have seen in other countries. For instance, in one Central American country, there was a big problem with illicit trade in alcohol, and taking holistic measures that were implemented together with awareness raising, not only of the consumers, but also of the policymakers, of how bad this problematic, what are the repercussions that they can have, we managed to really curb this problem. So it doesn't mean that it's impossible to solve it. It's just a matter of finding the resources and the will to do it. And that's why we are working here. I know that there are problems in South Africa. That's why we are working in the country. I know that there are reports of these things happening. There is corruption of public officials at many different levels. But it's something that we need to fight. I mean, we cannot simply give up because we believe that the whole system is rotten. This is not the case. We believe that this is not the case. These are just anomalies that need to be combated, that need to be dealt with. We understand that we have the way to do it, and that's why we created TRACIT. And this is the big challenge that we have. We have all the energy and all our efforts to endeavor towards this end.
Okay, so earlier you talked a bit about the impact of illicit trade on consumers in terms of even fake drugs and counterfeit products that they buy. So I want us to look at that now, expanding on that conversation. How does illicit trade create problems for South Africa's economy and consumers? Let's expand beyond that. It's easy to say the country loses 100 billion rand to this illicit activity, but at the long run, in real terms for the economy, in real terms for consumers as well, what is the impact?
Well, for consumers, I can come to the different sectors. Of course, it's a problem of consumers' health. Let me give you an example. During the pandemic, there were many countries that prohibited the production and commercialization of alcohol and tobacco. This was a direct driver for illicit trade. And for instance, in Mexico, where this policy was taken, after many years of not having any casualty for consuming illicit alcohol, suddenly that rate spiked. And there were, I think that in a couple of months, more than 80 people that passed away because of drinking counterfeit alcohol. I mean, this is a clear evidence of how can this affect consumers in this sense. Also, I can move to another sector. Let's say, for instance, illicit trade in fuel or other petroleum products. This happens through the Maputo corridor in South Africa, and there has been evidence that this can destroy the auto parts of the consumers, because of course the quality is lower in lubricants, and this is something that sometimes the consumer is not even aware. And just moving on a subject that is consumer awareness, on many occasions, because the counterfeits are of good quality, consumers can be unaware, and this can happen with illicit pharmaceuticals. And this is very disgraceful. Imagine being sick and taking a pill that hasn't been correctly stored, meaning that it's a genuine pill, but that was illegally diverted, or even worse, if it has been counterfeit. And there is evidence that there is even counterfeit medicines for people that are in intensive care. I mean, it cannot be more a consumer issue than what I'm explaining right now. It's a very big problem for the consumers. And parallel to that, indirectly, maybe the consumer doesn't feel affected by it, but if we continue exacerbating these great illicit economies, our countries are going to be more poor, we are going to have worse services, we're going to have less resources, and more criminality, and everything that comes along with that. And that's why we believe that this also needs to be seen from the part of the normal citizen, the consumer, the person that believes that probably taking something cheaper is intelligent, but in the long run it's going to affect us all, and we really need to meditate and take a decision on what kind of societies we want to have in 10 years, in 15 years, or even in 5 years, or currently. If we don't start tackling this issue right now, it's going to be more and more difficult.
All right, there's a final question I want to ask, but I want to quickly sneak this in. Esteban, quickly give me an answer in this. In terms of the fact that illicit trade is not a new problem for South Africa, especially when you talk about this illicit cigarettes and alcohol trade in particular. There's a role for South Africa's neighbors because it's funneled through many neighboring countries to get to South Africa. So what do we need to do in terms of the cooperation and the sort of alignments that needs to be done, let's even say in the SADC region, because South Africa is the market that so many of these individuals who are involved in this activity are targeting. For South Africa's neighbors and South Africa to work with its neighbors, what needs to be done very quickly so we can get to recommendations?
Yes, this drives me directly to the recommendation that has to do with effective cooperation, rationalization of tax between countries, not to generate drivers for illicit trade. If you have one jurisdiction with very high excise tax and the one that is next without that problem, this is what happened between Nigeria and Cameroon with many products subject to excise. This is a driver for illicit trade. So countries need to cooperate with multilateral organizations or bilaterally, and with TRACIT we aim to facilitate that, and we are working on that.
All right, so you've given us one of the recommendations, and earlier, of course, you mentioned the Financial Action Task Force having recommendations for South Africa as well because of the gray listing. And with this report, you've come out with estimates that global authorities also are put out for South Africa's illicit trade. So let's talk about recommendations that TRACIT has now. You've mentioned one now. What are these other recommendations in terms of South Africa getting a handle on the illicit activity?
Well, it's very important to strengthen the criminal penalties for many kinds of illicit trade, in the sense that there is very low deterrence, and that's why criminals keep on doing that, because it's better to illicit trade with, I don't know, counterfeit apparel than with drugs, because there is almost no risk with illicit apparel nowadays, but the gains, they are amazing. The criminal proceeds, they are super high. Another very important thing is to enhance international law enforcement cooperation with mutual legal assistance. There are many tools, international tools for doing this, and with TRACIT we help to do that. Another important thing that needs to be done, it's appointing an interagency anti-illicit trade coordinator. This is something that we have done with Paraguay, and it worked wonderfully many years ago, meaning that the efforts, they need to be coordinated. Otherwise, the effort from only one agency, the goal is squandered, and we need to find a way to find some traction with that. Another very important thing that needs to be done is awareness and education, but at all different levels, and that's what we try to do with TRACIT. Not only the general public, but also policymakers, because there are priorities. Sometimes we need to visualize this problem that touches many different things that need to be taken care of. So that's what we try to do with TRACIT. We try to talk with the policymakers, we do it, and we convince them that we need to put efforts on that. And finally, another thing that I already mentioned, that it's what happened during the pandemic, we need to avoid urgent or emergency tax or emergency prohibition laws, and these kind of decisions, they need to be taken in coordination with all relevant stakeholders, meaning private and public partnership. And that leads me to the last recommendation. It's very important that we manage to find good cooperation between the public and the private sector. This is why we created TRACIT, and this is what we are working on right now. The private sector takes responsibility to help the public sector to find sound policies to make our societies better.
All right, and so actually I lied. It's the final question coming in right on the tail end of that. You mentioned being in South Africa last week. You've also mentioned political will. So very quickly, just tell us, with the recommendations that TRACIT has given to South African authorities, you mentioned working with the police and some other agencies. Do you see South Africa being ready to tackle this issue?
I see light at the end of the tunnel. I saw political will last week. Now we are working on it. But let me invite myself to your program again. Give me a few months and I come back and I tell you what happened. I have lots of hope. We have lots of hope from TRACIT. We are going to do everything that we can, and we believe that the counterparts and the stakeholders in South Africa too. So it would be great to see in some months how this is going, how is it evolving. So yeah, I think that the prospects, they are humbly positive.
All right, Esteban, we'll take you up on that to see how much progress South Africa is making in the next few months. But thank you so much for joining me today. Esteban Jiduchi, Director of Programs at Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, and we'll be keeping our eye out on the situation in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.